By the end of the 5th century AD, the Garamantian civilization was no more. Under mysterious circumstances, likely caused by a combination of a crisis of declining slave labor and a collapsing system of trans-Saharan trade, the Garamantian kingdom gradually and permanently collapsed, ushering in a new era of history in the Fezzan. This is the traditional narrative of what happened in the ancient Fezzan. Typically, pop histories of the Garamantes will terminate here. The Garamantes collapsed, and then end of story. With this Irish goodbye of a conclusion, the readers are left to assume that the end of the Garamantian civilization must be the end of complex civilization and life in the Fezzan. After all, with the Foggara irrigation systems no longer working, how could people possibly support an agrarian lifestyle in such a harsh climate? But this conclusion does not represent the reality of life in the Fezzan following the quote-unquote collapse of the Garamantian civilization. And yes, as we explore this topic deeper, we'll see that the ideal of a civilizational collapse definitely deserves scare quotes around it. The archaeological reality is that despite the end of the Foggara system, life in the Fezzan continued. There was no mass exodus away from the cities, and a quite similar urban agrarian lifestyle to what had been practiced in the Garamantian era persisted. Hello everyone, and welcome to the finale of our 5th season of the History of Africa. This episode, we will explore the question of whether or not the Garamantian collapse was really a case of civilizational collapse at all, or if it was really just a case of political shifting and adaptation to meet the realities of a rapidly changing world. Season 5, Episode 7, Fezzan after the collapse. In the year 429 AD, entire populations were on the move throughout the Mediterranean world. Two peoples, one Germanic, called the Vandals, and the other one, Iranic, called the Alans, were just a pair of the dozens of so-called barbarian groups that were migrating throughout the Mediterranean world during late antiquity. In an effort to escape the violent chaos of Hunnic raids from the east, the Vandals and Alans invaded the Roman frontiers and wandered from place to place, looking for a new land where they could settle and call their own. Moving from Eastern Europe, they gradually marched over the generations up to France and into Spain. They fought wars both against and alongside the Romans, as well as against many other so-called barbarian peoples. Eventually, they were even pushed out of Spain by another invading Germanic group, and again fled, this time across the sea to Roman North Africa, where they were finally able to set up a kingdom to call their own. After successfully fending off a shockingly massive Roman counterattack, the kingdom of the Vandals and Alans was cemented as a state that would be here to stay. The beginning of Vandal rule in North Africa represents the beginning of a prolonged historiographical period of blindness regarding the Garamantes. While the Romans who preceded them only wrote about the Garamantes occasionally, the Vandals wrote pretty much nothing about them at all. The Vandals and Alans were literate peoples by this point, but the vast majority of their written records concerned theological details of the intricacies of various sectarian debates within the Christian world at the time. After all, the Vandals overwhelmingly practiced a splinter sect of Christianity known as Arianism, marked by a different set of beliefs regarding the Trinity that we went into a long time ago in our episodes on Izana of Aksum back in Season 2. The Christian controversy of the era dominated Vandalic pens, and left little room to reflect on the status of their southern neighbors during that time. Centuries later, the Romans would eventually recapture North Africa from the Vandals, but shortly thereafter, they lost control of the region to a new rising power that would radically transform the cultural landscape of North Africa in a way that persists to this very day. In 644, the rising Islamic Caliphate continued its dramatic early expansion beyond the Middle East and into North Africa. While summaries of the invasion often describe it as a single, rapid, and one-sided sweep across the northern coast of the continent, in reality, it was a long stretch of nearly 6 decades of intermittent military campaigning. During one of these campaigns, an Arab general had traveled south in an attempt to extract oaths of submission from various cities and nomadic groups living in the Sahara. When some of these groups decided to renege on their earlier oaths, an army led by the legendary Arab general Uqba ibn Nafi began a retaliatory march deep into the desert in 667 AD. The Arab histories of Uqba ibn Nafi's campaign, written centuries after the campaigns actually took place, provide us the first detailed written account of the political situation in the Fezzan since the Vandal invasion of North Africa. Describing an era long after the supposed collapse of the region's civilization, these histories paint an unexpected picture of a persisting and thriving Garamantian peoples. The people of the Fezzan, including within the Wadi al-Ajal, were not a desperate, starving remnant of the Garamantes living in the shadows of their once great civilization. Their cities were not abandoned husks of their former selves. Instead, they were still living in thriving urban centers, some of which even surpassed their peak population from the Garamantian era, and some of which had even been established quite recently. But there was one element of life in the Fezzan which had noticeably and obviously changed, which was the profound lack of political centralization. Now, Garama as a city remained a large urban center during this time period, but it was, like every other city in the region, an isolated and independent city-state, no longer the capital of some grander empire. The residents of the city, upon meeting the Arab invaders, didn't put up much of a fight. Instead, when Ibn Nafi asked them to abandon their polytheistic ways, convert to Islam, and submit to the authority of the Caliphate, they accepted, presenting Nafi with a large tribute of slaves and promising to accept Islam. While it would take a few more centuries for the society of Garama to fully adopt the faith and abandon their pre-Islamic religion, Nafi's invasion is usually the given date for a new era of Fezzani history, known, of course, as the Islamic period. Not every city opted to capitulate in the same way that Garama did, though. In particular, along his route, Nafi had to struggle against many walled and fortified hilltop settlements, which had become much more substantial in the Wadi al-Ajal by that time, a remnant of the era of collapsing central authority. But while it was no longer the capital of a larger empire, Garama continued to retain its status as one of the largest and most important cities in the Sahara. Its inhabitants, who were likely the direct descendants of the same people who had built the ancient city in the distant past, continued to operate as a major trade hub and center of agricultural production. Most impressively, they continued this lifestyle centuries after the abandonment of the Fugaras that are often used to mark the supposed end of their civilization. See, following the abandonment of the Fugaras, likely due to the tremendous labor cost of their maintenance, the Garamantes devised a new system to rely on a less labor-intensive means of access to the region's water table. This was a new type of well which utilized the help of a machine called a shaduf. A shaduf is an ancient machine of unclear origin. Some people say Egypt, some people say Mesopotamia. It really depends on who you ask, which relies on a basic lever and counterweight system to extract water from a well. A lever with a counterweight on its rear has its head pulled to the ground with a bucket hanging from its front. Then, after gathering water, the person working the shaduf releases the system, allowing the counterweight to pull the lever and return the bucket to the surface. A shaduf still requires some level of human labor to operate, but especially those that utilized an advanced system of pulleys were significantly more labor efficient than the pre-Fugara system of wells, while requiring less labor overall to build and maintain, and reaching further depths in the water table than a Fugara could have. Archaeological evidence that shows us the adaptation of shaduf technology begins shortly prior to the decline of the Fugara system, leading to an interesting chicken and egg scenario. How much of the Fugara's abandonment was motivated by the desire to use the more efficient shaduf? Or was the shaduf only popularized by the rising labor problems that were already making the Fugaras more and more difficult to manage? It's hard to say one way or the other. Regardless, the rising prominence of the shaduf in the post-Garamantes Fezzan allowed the lifestyle of sedentary farming in the Sahara to continue relatively uninterrupted. Even centuries after the abandonment of the Fugaras, fossil water continued to be harvested from shadufs, and of course it allowed the people of the Wadi al-Ajal to continue farming even water-hungry crops like cotton, melon, grapes, and more. But while Garama's agricultural sector stayed pretty strong, the Arab records following Nafi's invasion make it incredibly clear that Garama's status as the preeminent city of the Wadi al-Ajal was slipping. In fact, by the start of the 8th century, Garama would even begin to lose its role as the greatest city among equals, as a new rising metropolis between the dunes began to supersede the city's role. As Nafi's army made its way through the Wadi al-Ajal, they concluded their campaign at the geographic end of the valley, at a site which the later chronicles dubbed as the place that would later become the city of Zuwila. Judging by their syntax and supported by the archaeological evidence, Zuwila at the time of Nafi's invasion was likely little more than a small oasis settlement on the outskirts of the Wadi, with a couple of classical era fogaras near the city's outskirts and little else. But while the small settlement was the last step of Nafi's triumphant march, its position at the eastern mouth of the Wadi ensured that it, and not Garama, would become the first port of call for future Arab contact within the Wadi. In the coming centuries, when Arab caravans traveled from North Africa south into the Libyan Sahara, they typically avoided the large rocky escarpments on either end of the Wadi al-Ajal, and instead opted to enter through the entrance of the valley. This, of course, made Zuwila their primary stop. And evidence for the city's special relationship with Arab traders can be found buried underneath the sands. Archaeologically, most of the Wadi al-Ajal continue to use the Garamantian style pottery well into the medieval period, but Zuwila features a far more diverse mixture of Garamantian and Arab style pottery, which indicates close trade ties between Zuwila and their northern neighbors. Furthermore, North African rulers who intermittently tried to enforce their claims on the isolated land of the Wadi as a dependent territory, well, they typically relied on the people of Zuwila to collect their tribute or raise their soldiers from the region. In short, on the occasions when the Wadi al-Ajal was treated like a distant territory of a far-off Islamic empire, Zuwila was consistently treated as the de facto provincial capital. Despite the occasional overtures towards being a territory of a larger empire, though, it's pretty clear that Zuwila, and really the Sahara as a whole, remain conspicuously independent of external authority in day-to-day life. The greatest evidence of the region's nominal independence well into the Middle Ages was the widespread adherence to a slightly different form of Islam, known as Ibadiyya. Ibadi Muslims have a very interesting story all their own, tracing their origins back to some of the earliest sectarian breaks within the Islamic community, and today being known as the often overlooked third major branch within Islam, distinct from both Sunni and Shia. For various reasons, both theological and political, the early Ibadis were widely persecuted during the medieval period, and often had to conduct their faith in secret. But due to the geographic isolation and relative independence of the Fezzan, Ibadism was able to thrive, especially in the city of Zuwila, even during otherwise intense periods of persecution in the Islamic world. This wasn't to say that persecution never happened, as external powers would occasionally try to clamp down on Ibadism in the Sahara, usually making an example of a few well-known local Ibadi scholars, but the fact that the community was able to persist in Zuwila and the Fezzan as a whole for so long is a testament to the region's relative independence. But beyond its crucial role as the gate to the Wadi al-Ajal, Zuwila's success would further catalyze as it took the role as the main pit stop for trans-Saharan travel, a role which, of course we know, was once filled by Garama. The account of one Arab geographer, a man named al-Idrisi, describes Zuwila as a bustling center of commerce, linking the two sides of the Sahara. As he writes, "The town of Zuwila is in the desert. It is a small town with markets. From there one may go into the regions of the land of the black people. The inhabitants drink from wells of sweet water, and there are many palms with good fruit. Travelers bring merchandise there for its supply and all the things that are needed." But much like the Garamantes did before them, the people of Zuwila often had to contend with the same issues of controlling the nomadic and pastoral populations of the desert, who were just as keen to raid caravans as they were to facilitate them. The problem was apparent enough that even later in the same description of the city as a thriving trade hub, al-Idrisi even stops to warn would-be travelers about the potential danger of nomadic raiders waiting for them in the desert. But perhaps even more dangerous to Zuwila than the nomadic raiders was the same omnipresent threat that had haunted the Garamantes, the expansionist ambitions of larger, more powerful neighbors. Throughout the 11th century onwards, the city of Zuwila, while de facto independent in daily governance, had still been claimed by the Fatimid Khalif as a territory. The Fatimids are an interesting story in their own right, worthy of their own season one day, but what's important for our story right now is that they were a powerful and influential bunch. Starting as a humble Ismaili Shia community in northern Tunisia, the group catalyzed as it gained support from local Amazigh communities, and eventually overthrew the local elites before eventually even commanding large swaths of land, consisting of most of North Africa, a few parts of the Middle East, and even the European island of Sicily. Much like the relationship between the Romans and the Garamantes, it was clear to the people of Zuila that the Fatimids had the resources at their disposal to crush any kingdom that rose up in the Wadi al-Ajal if it became an inconvenience. As you may expect, Zuila went out of their way to appease Fatimid authorities as a result, often sending large tributary payments of gold, ivory, exotic fruits, feathers, enslaved workers, and even live animals like giraffes. This remained the status quo of the Fezzan for centuries, and the rulers of Zuila retained a degree of independence as tributaries to the Fatimids. However, it would turn out that powers to the north weren't the only nearby empire interested in conquering the Wadi al-Ajal. In fact, the power whose invasion would bring an end to centuries of relative local rule in the Fezzan was an empire from the south. Speaking of kingdoms and empires that deserve their own season, the Empire of Ghanem, located several hundred miles south of the Wadi al-Ajal, was rapidly ascending to become a tremendous regional power in its own right. Very little is known about how and why the Ghanem Empire rose to power when it did, or even really when it did, with reputable estimates ranging from about 300 AD, around the later stages of the Garamantian period, or even as late as 700 AD, just when Zuila was beginning to emerge as the main center of politics and commerce in the region. Likely originating as a coalition of nomadic people, including primarily Kanuri and Kanembu speakers, but possibly also some Tuareg or Tobo speakers as well, it's really unclear. This coalition dominated a collection of tributary states around Lake Chad and its surroundings. But by at least the 11th century, this system had developed into a more properly defined kingdom, ruled by a powerful monarch known as the Mai. The Kanembu language became the dominant tongue of the land, and the people, after years of religious struggle, eventually converted primarily to become Muslim, and set up a functioning state bureaucracy. Soon it seemed like the ever-expanding Ghanem Empire would be ready to expand into a new domain, north into the Sahara. And luckily enough, a series of political catastrophes in the Fezzan invited Ghanem's expansion into the region. The 12th and 13th centuries were a period of immense strife in the Fezzan, facilitated by out-of-control nomadic raiders, as well as common invasions of the regions from mercenaries gone rogue, ousted pretenders from various North African states invading their territory to set up a base of resistance, or the usual foreign leaders committing a punitive invasion to remind the Fezzanis of their vassal status to whichever power happened to claim them at a given time. The most devastating invasion came in 1172, when an, enslaved general, or Mamluk, from the Caucasus Mountains, fighting on behalf of the Egyptian Sultan, led an invasion of the Wadi al-Ajal. Sharaf al-Din Karakush, as he was known, captured the region's major cities, and upon capturing Zuila, the most important of them all, he tortured and eventually executed the king of the city, bringing the system of informal Zuila dominance to an end. While Karakush had fought initially on behalf of the Egyptian Sultan, he kind of established his own independent kingdom in a way. It's sort of complicated, before he was assassinated shortly thereafter, sending the now thoroughly devastated Fezzan into a true state of unrelenting chaos. A multipolar war began within the region, featuring some of Karakush's sons, other personal rivals, Amazigh clans, warring nomads, and local city governments. Ultimately, in order to end the chaos disrupting their northern trade routes and gain a greater degree of control over them, the Mai of Ghanem decided to invade the Fezzan, assassinating the last son of Karakush and annexing the territory as their own. The Mai selected a small, lightly populated oasis called Tragan to serve as the new provincial capital. And while this new emir of Tragan did enjoy a small degree of autonomy, the conquest of the Fezzan by Ghanem represented the first time in history when a foreign power was able to impose its government on the Wadi Ajal and have it last. I would argue that this final period of chaos, with the assassination of the king of Zuwila and the invasion of Ghanem, marked the final end of an identifiable continuity of culture and local governance of the Wadi al-Ajal. That was truly the day that the Fezzani civilization of the Garamantes was transformed, no longer the stubbornly independent heart of the Sahara, but now a mere appendage of a larger empire. Of course, this would not remain the case forever. Inevitably, Ghanem's rule over the Fezzan came to an end, and the region would intermittently act independently or as a province of a wider state. But it's worth noting that even centuries later, as the scramble for Africa began and Italy colonized the region in the early 20th century, they still found people living in the cities of Garama and Zuwila. These cities were full of ancient ruins, sure, but to the people who were living there, this wasn't some long-dead civilization, but simply the houses of their ancestors who had lived there before them. And it's worth noting that even today, thousands of years after the supposed Garamantian collapse, the descendants of the ancient Garamantes still thrive today in southern Libya. In fact, the ancient system of Fogaras would go on to influence modern Libya in a profound way. Even to this very day, more than 2/3 of the water consumed by modern Libyans through a modern take on the ancient Fogaras system, with the legacy of the Garamantian civilization still persisting in every last drop. And with that, we conclude this short season on the ancient Garamantian civilization of the Fezzan. Thank you all for listening. It was a pleasure to be able to share this history with you all. I can't wait to embark on our next journey, where we, as tradition, turn our gaze to East Africa. However, our next season's story will take place thousands of miles to the south of our last East African season setting. This time, we pivot to a region whose language and culture has become somewhat synonymous with the culture of the continent of a whole, whose seafaring exploits were legendary, and whose history is as fascinating as their reputation would suggest. Join us as we head to the Swahili coast and immerse ourselves into the origins of one of Africa's most internationally recognized cultures and the kingdoms they founded. Thank you for listening to the History of Africa podcast. If you like our show, then we would greatly appreciate if you could help support the show and our project of freely available online history education. You can do this by supporting us at patreon.com/historyofafrica, providing us a rating or review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or iTunes, or by sharing the podcast with anyone who you think might enjoy learning about African history. This episode is brought to you by our supporters on Patreon, including Naomi Kanakia, Ayo Fagbamie, Dimitri, Alexander Travis, Bibi Milliam, Conrad Schwenke, Johnny Knowles, Godfrey Sibalabie, Pascal Mwokocha, Joe Maxwell, Nkechi Nwabadike, Sheyu Nolorontimain, Kwajo Amankwa, Douglas Harder and Sherry Robinson, Craig Bolton, Samuel Badeau, Ghassan Firjiani, Nee T, Kitty, Tariq Beetleman, Kelvin J. Norris, Ellen Fisher, Afrocentric Beauty, and Jessica, among others. Thank you all for supporting the show. It really, 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 really means a lot.